great to chat to you again. So much been going on just in the last week, but I've been talking to more and more CEOs, particularly of EMS companies, but also OEMs, and this topic of accelerated digital transformation and accelerated innovation keeps coming up. Do you see that kind of compression of those processes being something that people are talking to you about?
I do feel, and I have exactly the same feedback as you are getting, and I think it's partly a product of something that had been happening for the last several years. So we've seen innovation accelerate, and I think all CEOs were conscious and increasingly focused on it. But I also think what's happened now with the pandemic has really concentrated the mind for several reasons. One is that there is a push to try to figure out how can we use innovation and new technologies to navigate our way around the disruption of this pandemic. And the second is the pandemic, with the economic impact, which is becoming more and more severe, is focusing the mind on how can we use innovation to improve productivity, improve efficiency, improve speed, reduce costs now, not tomorrow. So now the urgency is becoming a lot stronger. So yeah, I'm definitely feeling the same.
Yeah, and it's curious, isn't it? Like you mentioned, it started out with that urgent response. How do we respond? We're now in this phase of, we seem to be in this kind of new normal. We're not sure when we're coming out of the crisis. We're not sure how deep the crisis will be. And we definitely don't have an idea what recovery will look like. But then we've also got to look to the future and see what better models are. When you talk to people, where do you see them in those three phases? Are they stuck in the urgent? Are they working on the important? Or are they looking to the future?
It's really a mixture, Phil. So some of the people I talk to, including some of my clients, are really slotted in the three different buckets that you mentioned. Some are still struggling to survive because, and it really depends also on the sectors, because some industries have been impacted more heavily than others. So there are some CEOs who are still trying to figure out, how do I survive this quarter and then next quarter, and how do I survive the crisis? So they're really in survival mode and trying to limit damage. Others are beginning to take a more strategic approach to this, and beginning to think, okay, how can I think beyond the crisis to the future? Where do I want to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, however long this takes? So these are the ones who feel more confident, clearly. Maybe they have a bigger financial cushion. Maybe they're in an industry which is a bit more insulated by the crisis, and so they can afford to think really long term. And then you have the ones who are more focused on trying to understand how does this pandemic and crisis really play out? And how long does it last? It's the uncertainty you were alluding to. And they're focusing on it for two reasons. One is because it has a financial and economic impact, but also because they're trying to understand how to guide their strategy and their innovation strategy depending on what the next 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 months look like. So it's really a variety of approach. And I think this variety of approach and reactions mirrors and reflects not just the different views and expectations that people have about the uncertainty, which is really multidimensional, but also, of course, the different degree to which they are impacted by the current situation. So it's, you see them all.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think what you say about companies viewing it differently based on where they are and what their own situation is really interesting, because I think one of the things that the crisis have done is to shine a light on problems that exist in the ecosystem, problems that exist in our industry, but also problems that exist in certain companies. And we talked about the acceleration of innovation and digital transformation, and necessity is the mother of invention, so that happens. But also, I was chatting to a European consultant that covers the EMS industry, and prior to the crisis, he predicted that there would be a 20% erosion in the number of EMS companies in Europe over the next 10 years. He's now changing that prediction to 3 years because he believes that there'll be an accelerated change as a result. So there's kind of negative acceleration as well as positive acceleration. So there's all kinds of challenges. One of the things that I'm really curious about, and this is again feedback I've got from CEOs, is yes, they want to digitally transform. And if you
Who
look at
doesn't?
polls, yeah, if you look at polls, it's a high percentage. It's also a high percentage that aren't sure how to go about it. It's also a high percentage that feel that they're perhaps underfunded to do it. And then when I talk to CEOs about other outputs of the current crisis, a lot of them have got board pressure to reduce investment, capital investment particularly, and not increase it. There's a very tricky compromise there, isn't there? Of pressure to transform, but pressure to not spend money on investing. How do you see that playing out?
So it's a very good point, Phil. And I think it plays out to the advantage of those CEOs, those companies that have already figured out what kind of digital transformation they need. Because, as you were mentioning at the beginning, and you see it in surveys, almost every CEO, almost every company says they are committed to digital transformation. So this idea of the digital transformation, which several years ago was still very nebulous and people talked about it, but many people were still skeptical. Now the skepticism has disappeared. So everybody buys into it. Everybody has seen the micro level examples. Everybody believes in the potential value. And so when you talk to them, they all say, yes, we are committed, it's going to happen. But not many have understood what does it mean for me? Is it 3D printing? Is it bringing artificial intelligence to restructure my supply chain? What kind of digital transformation do I need? And then I think what happens, Phil, is that in a situation where these companies are financially stressed because revenues are down, market growth is down, there is uncertainty as to when it will recover, as you say, boards then put the pressure on. They say, well, if you know what you're going to invest in, and if you can present a convincing story as to what the return of investment is going to be, then yes, or maybe. But if you don't, then if you just want to invest for routine investment, then no, this is not the time. And so I think the people who have a clear idea in mind right now will be able to jump ahead of the curve. The others will be stuck. And maybe that ties to your other comment, the idea that you heard in Europe that the companies which are weaker, less well performing, more of them will go out of business faster.
Yeah, and I think they'll either go out of business. I think there'll be some acquisition opportunity. I was talking to a couple of American EMS companies today, and they use the word cannibalism, and they believe that will be a factor in the industry. When I talk to some people, one of the things that they've been interested in, and they actually have been curious and concerned about, is that some of their suppliers haven't been as creative as they should be. They haven't had calls from their CapEx suppliers saying, how can we do things differently? How can we help you out in this time? We've got a solution that's going to help you with efficiency or something like that. How can we make that more palatable for you at the moment? And I think companies that do that have got an opportunity to win. Companies that don't and just are saying, well, this is a great solution, but it's a big ticket item, that's going to be really challenging. I wonder if we're going to see a greater growth in disruptive business models, some of which we're already seeing. So I look at robotics as a service as one of those. And, I've been watching carefully companies like Bright Machines in San Francisco, MTech in Sweden, that have these very adaptable automation solutions, and as well as being able to provide those great ROI models that you talk about and being able to measure performance with good solid KPIs. they're also capable of moving their offering from CapEx to OpEx and to actually say, okay, well, we're replacing X number of people, which has this inherent cost in, but we're able to rent you the equipment at this specific cost. And when you don't need the equipment, you can possibly return it or possibly reuse it elsewhere. Do you see people being more creative? Because necessity does have to be the mother of invention here.
I do, but for two reasons. One is that the model you're describing, which is the shift from capex to opex, or rather from offering to your customers capital investment solution, you're now offering operational improvement solutions. And I think this gives two benefits. One is it allows you to give your customers more flexible solutions. You allow them to really buy the services as they need them, to pay for something that immediately maps into a return. But the second reason why it is becoming more prevalent and why it is a winning strategy is that it's a way for you as a supplier to be closer to your customer, to help your customer understand what works, what can really address their problems. And I think that that is really the magic solution, because when you approach customers with robotics as a service or manufacturing as a service solution, you're showing that you're making an effort to understand what can move the needle for them and say, look, I know what you need. I know what can get you the greatest mileage in terms of cost reduction or greater efficiency. And if I don't know it well enough, I want to talk to you and work with you to figure it out better and then give a solution that you can immediately use. So I think that's definitely a growing solution and a growing trend that will have increasing success.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're seeing the same in, I think those are the small, isolated instances where you're taking a process and you're actually disrupting it and you're changing it and you're creating a really solid ROI model, which makes it much more compelling. And maybe that means the CEO can sell it to the board, but it actually might mean that the factory manager, the specific local GM, actually has the power to make that decision and transaction themselves, because they have control over OpEx, but they don't have control over CapEx. But what we're also have seen over the last couple of years, and I think are coming to the fore and really showing their mettle right now, are some much larger disruptors to the whole manufacturing ecosystem. And there I'm talking about companies like Fictive in the 3D printing and CNC and molding space. I'm talking about companies like Macrofab in the PCBA space, companies like PCH International, where they have deployed sourcing teams. They have a completely asset-light model, and they have the chairman of their board is Mike McNamara, former CEO of Flex. So that's someone from the established industry looking to the future and saying these new disruptive models are valid. And I know you took part in a webinar recently with some of the people at Fictive, so you know them well. How do you see those models fitting in the future of the industry, and how big a role are they going to play? How big is the wave they're going to create of disruption?
I think that they will play a pivotal role in the manufacturing ecosystem of the future, because they create a greater flexibility and therefore greater resilience at the systemic level. And we are beginning to realize only now how important that is and what that means. I'll give you an example of an issue that came up in the discussion in this seminar with the Fictive friends and with some of the customers in the Q&A, which is the issue of resilience. And now that supply chains, distribution systems, everything is under stress because of the pandemic and the economic shock. Everybody talks about resilience and how do you make your own structure, your own supply chain system more resilient. But then there is the point that because everything is interrelated and interdependent, your own setup will be as resilient as its weakest link. So if one of the suppliers in your system is not resilient, then you are not resilient either. And the way to address this is with a system, ecosystem plays like Fictive, which really create a networking. So it is a disruptive solution because it throws away completely some of the established advantages of some, especially some of the larger companies. So it is profoundly disruptive, but I think it will become recognized increasingly as a must, as something that you have to tap into if you really want to have access to that level of flexibility and resilience.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because that flexibility and resilience, they're almost, it's kind of, we want to be agile, but we want to be robust. They're almost counterintuitive. It's almost like you can have one or the other, but you clearly can have both. And that's where the desire is. I'm curious not just to see the success of those kind of disruptive companies, because I think they will come through, but the response of the traditional industry to that, the traditional industry that has this massive footprint. We've got companies like Foxconn with over 1 million staff, but even the big US companies like Jabil and Flex with north of 200,000 people and up to 100 factories worldwide. Adapting that model is going to be really fascinating and really challenging. And I wonder, when I look at what's going on. Interestingly, you're calling in from San Francisco, but you're an Italian. I'm from the UK, and I'm calling in from Melbourne, Australia. So we kind of have this global view, but from a US point of view, you're in the process of an election year, which is, to my mind, a disruption in itself. It's always a strange time. I think Ronald Reagan always used to call it silly season. Because the economy kind of shifts and stuff. But I'm curious, if you were in a position, Marco, where you were able to design some of those government incentives that the candidates are talking about, and so many different leaders in different countries are talking about and have deployed. Japan, for example, putting billions into shifting supply chain out of China. How would you do that? I've got my own ideas, but I'm kind of curious to what you would do if you had control of those purse strings and you could design some incentives that would be good for manufacturing.
It's a great question. It's a very tempting proposition, the idea of being in charge of designing these incentives. I think that the first thing I would do is take a step back and be very aware of the risk of designing incentives which are too much carefully designed to obtain a very specific solution, like getting manufacturing to come back into your own borders or promoting a single specific industry. I think
it's almost be careful what you wish for, isn't it, Marco?
Be careful what you wish for. It's also being aware of the law of unintended consequences, right? Because you need to try to think several steps ahead. Take the example you mentioned of Japan giving incentives for companies to move supply chains out of China. That can be a sensible strategy given some of the concerns that have emerged during these last several months. But then you have to wonder what happens once the move out of China happens and what kind of different vulnerabilities might be created. A different example is there's a lot of discussion often in the US on the need to reshore manufacturing, to bring manufacturing activities back into the country. And certainly some of what we've seen during the pandemic has brought home the fact that in an emergency, it's likely that even your strongest geopolitical allies will not be too cooperative if there's a shortage of pharmaceutical components or critical products for a supply chain. So yeah. The natural reaction to say, well, I should have everything within my border so I'm self-sufficient makes sense from that perspective. But then you have to realize it's inefficient and it's a concentration of risk, because then if anything happens that paralyzes production within your borders, that's it. You can't rely on anybody else. So being mindful of the unintended consequences, I think it's crucial. What I would do, going back to your direct question, is I would first, even beyond incentives, I would try to design a program of infrastructure investment at the central, federal, here in the US, and local government level. I think that is the first thing, because the infrastructure is needed for the digital transformation of all companies. Secondly, I would personally, I would be in favor of fiscal incentives, accelerated fiscal incentives for investment in new technologies, especially digital industrial technologies. So that would be one of my top priorities, to get companies to invest more heavily and more quickly in this fourth industrial revolution. And I think that would be money well spent.
Absolutely.
Combining in that with maybe some strengthening of the safety net. I think there's something else that strikes me as we have this discussion on incentives and policies is one headwind will be the concern about automation and loss of jobs, which was already prominent before when we had 3% unemployment. Imagine now. But so I think you need to temper the incentives to digital industrial innovation with a strengthening of the social safety net and a strengthening of education and training that signals clearly that you have a plan in place where this investment will then map into more and better jobs. So these would be my priorities, but you are the expert on this. What would you do?
No. I mean, the "if I ruled the world" question that always comes up with me when I'm talking to people. It's interesting. I 100% agree with you. I would want to incentivize digital transformation. I've had discussions down here with people at government level in Australia, and I feel strongly that that's a policy that I would put way in front of any protectionist policies. I'm very much a globalist, and I believe in the market. So I think the idea of using that potential money that would be used to revive the economy, to push digital transformation, is huge. I absolutely agree. You've got to be very careful what you wish for, and the comment we shouldn't build China in the US is absolutely right, and we shouldn't do that. But one of the comments on a show I was on recently, and that was with two CEOs of large, mainly in the Americas, EMS companies, I asked a similar question: what would you like to see done? And both of them said, give us tax breaks and let us decide what to invest in. We know what to invest in. I think the other thing you mentioned there, which is really important, is the talent issue. And I think investing to make sure there's enough talent there is really important. One of the issues that I think is interesting is you've got a big incentive to bring a company like Tesla into Texas and build a mega factory, I think they call it. And that's great because it will bring jobs there and it keeps that manufacturing in the US. But what it means is it puts more pressure on skills and talent within that area. So the established businesses, the EMS companies, for example, in that area, are going to be challenged when it comes to recruiting talent, because maybe Tesla's slightly more glamorous to work for than an EMS company, because maybe EMS companies are not seen as the highest paying, but actually the engineering and STEM careers in EMS are pretty well paid when you look at it as kind of national averages. So I think there are a whole bunch of strange dynamics, and your comment about that unintended consequences, I tend to think in those broad strokes and think, okay, we're going to pay everybody to put AI into their factories, and that would be great. but there are consequences of it. There are consequences of having your supply chain within your borders. And if the supply chain, I'm in Melbourne at the moment, and we're in a fairly serious lockdown. If our supply chain was very localized, that supply chain is actually the one that's most at risk. The stuff that we're importing from overseas is a lot less at risk at the moment. And when you look at the cycle of this process, China was the first in, but it was also the first out. It went in and it shut down and it locked down quite aggressively. So maybe it came out a bit quicker. We don't know how the second wave and third waves are going to play in terms of what impact they'll have on structure. So actually moving stuff from one geography to the other, apart from being very difficult in itself, has its own inherent risk. So I guess the answer is it's not that easy to be government and design incentives.
No, and you brought up a point which I think is extremely important. The CEOs telling you our dream is, yes, give us some tax breaks for incentive, for investment, but then let us decide we know where to invest. There's an element of risk mitigation there, which is that for something, sometimes you have to take big bets. And for example, if you figure that a 5G network is essential and it's going to be great for especially industrial level digital technology and digital solution, fine, you need to build it, you need to decide what standards. There are some big decisions that have to be taken at the government level. But otherwise, my attitude has always been that the incentives that the government gives for investment should be technology neutral. Because it's hard for a very smart CEO to figure out the right investment at the level of a company. For a government to figure out the right incentive, the right investments for the entire country is nearly impossible. So there you're taking a massive risk. Whereas if you leave flexibility to the companies to figure it out, you have a much better chance that through the competition, they will get it right.
Yeah, and I think also when you deploy that decision, maybe the decisions are made more locally with more variable circumstances, but also as a government, then you don't have to take the blame for a dictatorial industrial policy. If what you're going to have is you're going to have a smoothing out where some investments are going to work really well and some are perhaps not. Whereas if you go down a single route and you do take that huge bet, I agree with you that betting on infrastructure is usually a good thing, and we always need to invest in infrastructure, and whether that infrastructure is 5G or 6G or whatever comes next, it doesn't matter. We know we're going to need to transmit and move more data around the world. So I think that's huge, but also logistics and infrastructure like that. And I think part of the success of China has been they don't have to have elections, so they're able to have a long-term industrial policy. They're able to invest in infrastructure throughout the country, high-speed railways, infrastructure in the supply chain has also been very successful. I always say they kicked the door down with low-cost labor and they kept it open with great logistics and supply chain. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And actually, I think it's really fascinating to watch the debates as they occur during the election from a point of view of knowing what's going on inside the industry, and I'm always curious as to how that looks to politicians. It's like they see things slightly different to us sometimes.
Indeed.
Indeed. So one of the other things that I've seen without any doubt is fundamental changes in the way we do things. This interview we might have set up a studio and done together. We normally talk over a coffee when I'm in San Francisco, or go out and have lunch together. We can't do that at the moment. People are changing the way they do not just their work, the way they live their lives. Do you see that working from home, those remote collaborations for product design and all those things, do you see some of that staying? Do you see people kind of picking the best from the pandemic world and the pre-pandemic world to come up with something that is the post-pandemic ideal?
I think some of it will definitely stay. I don't know that it will stay forever, but it will stay. And again, with differences across industries, but what I see is that companies are realizing that for some people from some portion of their workforce, working from home works. It's just as efficient, it can be more convenient. Then you get to the next stage, which is realizing that it can be actually very effective and very financially advantageous for both the company and the employee. The company can save on office space. The employees can relocate to areas where the cost of living is lower. And so everybody wins and you get a better distribution and a happier workforce. And I can
Yeah.
see this getting traction. Again, there are some areas, some environments where working from home is nowhere near as efficient, but for some, I can see it getting traction. So I believe that for the next few years, it will become a lot more prevalent. I also said I'm not sure it will stay forever because I think it's going to take us some time to figure out what the hidden costs are. And for example, we're all fixated on we've seen very clearly the fact that experienced employees who already have a network of connections within the company can work very effectively from home. If you're coming into the first job now, and all you have is Zoom meetings with the new
Yeah.
colleagues, I don't know how quickly you can come up to speed. So
I
I
think
think,
it's difficult. Interestingly, Marco, my son changed jobs 3 weeks into the lockdown in London. He works for one of the big marketing agencies in London, and he switched, and the whole switch occurred in lockdown. So it was literally having a laptop dropped off at his door, and his first meeting with his colleagues was a Zoom meeting, and I think he was 2 and a bit months in, and quite recently when he first met his colleagues, and that's really challenging. We kind of come at this, as you say, from a position of having a network, being very experienced in working from home. You know, we're either working from home or from airports, or we're in and out of different people's offices, but we're very mobile and nomadic in our working style. So I can see that would be very difficult for certainly for people in their first role.
but also it also raises some very interesting questions because, and I like to link it to the debate we've seen, at least in the United States, on the geographical distribution of job opportunities and incomes, where we've seen a massive increase in opportunities and wealth on the coasts, and especially in big cities, and the hollowing out of the manufacturing areas in the center of the country. And so now this gives you the opportunity to disperse the workforce in a much more granular way across the country, in different areas of the country, which in turn can create economic activity in a much more distributed way, and can also create pools of talent that would then allow manufacturing to also look at different areas and maybe get stronger, especially when you bring it together with some of the new technologies that also make manufacturing more flexible and potentially also more efficient at smaller scales. So I see this as something which could bring a very, very interesting potential in redistributing the map of talent, career opportunities, and economic growth across geographies, which would not necessarily be a bad thing.
No, and I think one of the things I've seen, I often look at this and think, what have we lost and what have we gained? And I like the creativity that I've seen from people in terms of the way they're doing their business. So, for example, there's a lot of really good fine dining restaurants in Melbourne, and they've had to close their doors. But they've been really creative in sending out meal boxes and things that people can finish at home. So they've created a new business model for themselves. And when we first came out of lockdown, they had a very low capacity in their restaurants. So there was a likelihood that they were going to do both for a while. And then when there was an announcement that we would release more numbers so they could have more people in their restaurants, they were going to stop their delivery service. And for me, that was a real shame, because I thought it was a real add value for the consumer and a real add value for them. It might not stop me going to their restaurant, but I might use that as an additional service. So I think that creativity has been really important, and I see that as something we've learned. I also see the way that people have been taking care of each other as something that has been a positive from this. You know, people are checking in on neighbors, making sure they've got enough food, checking in on their relatives maybe more often. I know I do Zoom calls with my family overseas probably more than I did before the crisis, and it feels like I need to, because I want to know what's going on and I want to stay in touch. So I think that's interesting. But from a company and an industry point of view, we've also seen awesome collaborations there. So we've seen companies that would traditionally see themselves as competitors collaborating because they're maybe making two parts of a ventilator that has, you know, there's kind of a bigger story than the companies competing here. So they feel they have to do that. And the way we've seen 3D printing companies step up in the PPE side of things, but also in the test swabs and different examples like that. So we've seen some great collaboration and communication, and that's something I hope we keep. I think that's something that's great for the industry, and just this ability to ask for help, which I don't think was a natural part of particularly American corporate culture in the past. Whereas now you can almost call up one of your, almost a competitor, and say, hey, we're kind of stuck on this. We need to get this ready for a particular medical requirement or a particular industry requirement. Can you help out? People seem keen to listen to new ideas.
Yeah, and I think it comes, it's a very good point, Phil. I think it comes from two different drivers. One is the more noble aspect of human nature, which in a situation where we all feel under existential risk, we tend to look out for each other. But which is also it's the mirror image of what we discussed earlier, which is countries hoarding equipment and hoarding pharmaceutical products. And so there is the counterpart in this ecosystem approach, where at the personal level, at company level, you look out for each other. But there is also another element, which is more of a kind of selfish realization, and being selfish as an economist, I think it's going to be more sustainable, which is when you suddenly realize that if most of the ecosystem around you collapses, you as a company will not survive either. You realize that if all your competitors collapse, but so do your customers, there's not going to be a market left. So you might be the most resilient company, but you can't survive alone. And so I think this is a realization that hopefully will stay in people's mind for a while. And hopefully we'll get corporate leaders to realize that, yes, some level of cooperation actually does pay off, and it reduces risk. Now, it might wear off once the pandemic is over and we go back to normal. It might wear off after a few years, and then we'll need another crisis. But in today's world, it looks like there's not going to be any shortage of new crises. So,
no, it's absolutely right. And we don't know what the next one's going to be. And I think you're absolutely right. In the past, when you look at crisis, you think, did we really learn from that? Did we forget way too quickly? But I think going on from cooperation, what you talk about there in terms of codependence is really important. You've got to understand where you live in an ecosystem, and how important it is that not just your customers do well, but your suppliers and the whole ecosystem around them does well. One of the areas that obviously I've covered quite a lot recently is what's happened in terms of the way we sell and the way we market our business. We're used to going to trade shows. We're used to going out and spending some time with customers and taking them out to lunch and doing all that fun stuff, or taking them for a game of golf or whatever. And we can't do that right now. One of the big pieces of news in the last week or so was CES not cancelling but going virtual. So to my mind, you know, that's 150,000 people that don't go to Las Vegas in January. Interestingly, quite a positive environmental impact from that and sustainable impact. But I'm curious what you see in terms of the change in marketing ecosystems. I'm talking to people about what they're seeing, and I think people see a lot of doubt and a lot of negativity about virtual trade shows when you're actually trying to mimic a trade show in the virtual world. But actually, some of the tools, like the webinars that you've been taking part in, like the online communication, the more digital tools, seem to be very, very successful.
Yeah, and I think so. My personal take on it is I'm also skeptical of the virtual recreation of traditional trade shows, because I think trade shows, as we know them, have evolved in their current shape for a very specific reason. Partly it's because you need economies of scale. So you're bringing out different innovation in the same place. You need to concentrate to bring together everybody at the same time. And so as you get hundreds of thousands of people to travel to Las Vegas, you need to bring in lots of new products and solutions for them to look at the same time. And that is not the right approach in a virtual show in my mind, because we know that one of the advantages of virtual solutions is that they allow you to have something which is more flexible and more personalized. So for me, we need to think about restructuring trade shows in ways that allow you to separate out the different offerings, to target different segments of audience segments separately maybe over a longer stretch of time. So we need to rethink this approach in digital marketing completely, rather than trying to mimic the physical approach. Because otherwise, I think the technologies we have are excellent, but they're very far. I mean, you and I know each other well, but even knowing each other well, discussing like this on Zoom is not the same thing as being at the
No,
same coffee
as
table.
being together.
There's a
Yeah.
lot that gets lost. And so that value of the personal interaction, the serendipity of meeting people in the corridors and in the hotels and in the halls of the trade show is something that people will miss and will want to go back to. So for virtual shows to compete and give us something different and something more on a more permanent basis, I think we need to rethink the approach completely and think about what can you do with virtual tools that you can do with in-person shows.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point of that customization and personalization, which you can't do when you've got the economy of scale. And when I look at the virtual tools that we have used and some of the shows we've set up, some of the webinars we've done, great value, very, very, you know, they achieve a great deal. But as you say, one of the things that I always think when I've been to a trade show, and I don't think I've ever been to a trade show and come away and thinking that was a waste of time, because there's always that fortuitous meeting in a coffee shop, or there's that, hey, I walked onto that booth of that company I wouldn't have dreamed of looking for through traditional methods. So, and I absolutely agree, trying to mimic something that has been done traditionally in the real world, in the virtual world, rarely is successful. You know, it's like people, if you ask people what they want, they might say a better trade show. But as Henry Ford was fond of saying, when he asked people what they wanted a faster horse. They didn't want a car. And it was actually a car that they needed. So you've kind of got to be quite disruptive and get ahead of that game. But in the future, I see this really interesting hybrid, and the way it's playing out best, and the companies that are thinking about it most strategically are those that aren't saying, how do we mimic what we had before and do it again? It's, what were the deliverables of that event? Why did we go to CES? Why did we go to Electronica? Why did we go to Apex? How many leads did we generate? How many customers did we see and make announcements to? what was our thought leadership program? What was our media program? And then how can we take part of that budget, shift it across and achieve those same deliverables? And then maybe when we come back and we've got the option of doing the show as well, maybe when we do the show as well, we'll focus much more on those networking opportunities. And for thought leadership, we'll continue to use these digital models. So I think there's it's almost mimicking what's going on in the manufacturing space. It's figuring out what works really well, what we need to go back to the old version. And the same with people working from home, figuring out who can continue to work from home and who has to go in there. On that side, I'd seen some fascinating examples. One was a CEO I spoke to who started his business in his garage, as so many of these entrepreneurs do. When he saw the crisis coming, he rented a whole bunch of spaces that were kind of garage size. Some of them were garages, close to certain key members of his staff. And he moved pieces of equipment in for them. So he built like 10 different workshops around, all within 25 miles of his factory, but knowing that his staff might not have access to his factory, which I thought was genius. And I love this
That's
garage,
brilliant. Yeah, that's
garage
brilliant.
to factory, back to garage idea. It's just so creative. And I admired that. But on the flip side, we're seeing big companies like Facebook and Google saying, mid 2021, before we even look at getting everybody back into the office again, because it's working. It's working so well, and we're building that functionality. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating time. We're seeing all kinds of lessons learned, all kinds of new dynamics occurring. Just as we wrap up, Marco, what do you see as the big lessons being learned? What do you see the big lessons that the crisis is teaching us and will help us improve in the future?
So I see some positive and negative lessons. Let me encapsulate them as succinctly as I can, which where my Italian blood comes in, and instead push me to wax philosophical for a long time. But number one, we need to be more. We need to be harder on ourselves and force ourselves to really look at the numbers and to think rationally. Because for me, the first takeaway from the current crisis is that 6 months into this pandemic, too many people around still don't understand the basic numbers. The media don't report the basic characteristics of the risk of this pandemic. It is stunning. Gallup has recently done a poll in the US where they show that on average, Americans still misunderstand massively the differential in mortality risk for different age categories.
Yeah.
And it's stunning. And I think this has created too much noise around the policy response and the personal response. So when we face something like this, we all say that we are in a data-driven world, in a data-driven age. We need to start looking at the data rather than making stuff up.
Yeah. Well, there's two things there. One, we need data. We need data, but we need to be able to understand this data. And it's the same for any factory intelligence system or any intelligence system. You need dashboards that give you clear information, and you need to be protected from complexity, but you need to know that the data you're seeing is right, it's up to date, and it's in real time. And I find that really hard, and I can read that stuff pretty well. You're an economist, so you understand it better. But it's confusing, isn't it? It's confusing when you're seeing case numbers, when you're seeing mortality numbers, when perhaps you don't know what the test numbers are. You have to look at things per population. Then you look at things per population and you realize that actually the incidents are in a very isolated location. So you have to consider that rather than the broader population. It's a complex statistical
it's a complex
thing.
statistical game, but that is where you would hope that epidemiologists, political
Mm,
leaders, and media leaders would try to give better information rather than
yeah,
use this complexity
I
to
would like that.
befuddle people. And that's not been happening. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two, Phil, is I hope that this will give us a more pragmatic and sober attitude to innovation and technology, because
Mm,
the discussions over the last several years have been dominated by hype on the magic of technology on one side and the doom and gloom technophobia on the other. But then the pandemic strikes, and all of a sudden, after a discussion which has been dominated by the promise of personalized medicine and magical solution that will give you just targeted therapy just for you and eliminate all disease, all of a sudden we get a variation on the common cold, and the only reaction we have is the same that we had for the plague in the 14th century. Stay
mm,
home, wash your hands. So that is sobering when you think about, have we really made much progress on technology? And I think but I think the positive twist on this is instead of getting caught between the hype and the fear of these new technologies, we need to focus more on what the technologies can do for us and where do we have to accelerate investment so that we can reap
mm,
the benefits faster. Because in some cases, some technologies on the manufacturing side, as we discussed earlier, have delivered enormous value. A lot of us can work from home. Factories have been able to rearrange production. Supply chains have reorganized thanks to manufacturing as a service platforms.
mm.
Those are the areas where you can see the value. So I hope the second lesson that comes from this crisis is to focus more on how technology can help us and help the economy become more efficient and pushes us to invest more and invest in a smarter way in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's huge, and I think having those focused investments and driving them from specific need is really important. And you make a very good point. You know, we're in this situation now where we're waiting for a vaccine as the silver bullet, and that's a slow process. You know, in terms of innovation and bringing that product and that solution to the market and getting it through not just the regulation, but a due diligence is a very long, slow process. And the longer that process takes, the more impact this crisis is going to have on us economically, and the harder it is going to be to get out of this. Marco, we could talk all day, and sometimes we do, but we certainly shouldn't on this particular show. There are things that I'd like to cover with you on another occasion. One of them is sustainability, but I also think there's a whole group of really interesting dynamics in the industry. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you again. But for today, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This is a great pleasure. Thanks so much.